Gutierrez. This is Zoe, and this is Classlet 4, Mad Women, Angry Men. Thank you very much for joining me. I apologize for the hiatus. This takes a little longer than I thought it would, but that's okay. You're all busy too. It's all good. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the rise of psychiatry and the nascent disciplines of the mind in the 19th century, and their relationship to and competition with spiritualism, as well as many other new religious movements. So the turn of the 19th century is really the first time that we see medical doctors looking at madness as something that could be cured. Right? Prior to this, they would just take the so-called lunatics and throw them in this huge, vile warehouses that were filthy and disgusting, and chain people to walls and literally just change the hay under them. Revolting. But around the turn of the 19th century, we have two major forces. There's a French guy, Monsieur Pinel, and a British guy, William Tuke, and later his grandson, Samuel, who decide that madness is curable. Right? So this is, phenomenally exciting, and nobody believes them. They're like, oh, you're going to unchain the crazy people, all hell's going to break loose, they'll just be rampant, crime in the streets. And this is a very famous painting of Pinel unchaining the madmen at Bicêtre. And mad women, obviously. So, those are the two sort of major developments in the 19th century in terms of the treatment of madness. Now, what did they do instead? Well, instead of chaining people to walls, they turned the impetus inward so that the mad person was responsible, right, to his doctors and nurses and to the asylum itself for getting better. Right? And the form of this is called moral management. Now that's from the French, so it doesn't actually mean moral as in ethical, right? It just means the management of how things are run. But the irony is not unfounded in terms of the English translation into moral management. Yeah. So, some of the primary folks to read about this, and my class has read them, Elaine Showalter, phenomenal book, and Sandra Gilman, Particular Difference in Pathology. It was my great pleasure in graduate school to have a class with him. I know you're never going to watch this, Dr. Gilman, but hi, I think fondly of you. I tell all my classes about ontology, recapitulating phylogeny, ontogeny. Please don't ever watch this. Okay, so what does moral management mean? Well, moral management means that the proof of sanity is that you can adequately demonstrate that you adhere to middle-class values. So, those are not sneezing at the table. Zoe's crazy. No, seriously, those are, sobriety, appropriate sexuality, chastity for, girls, and, being quiet, and above all, being industrious. All right, so both the French and the British versions of moral management involved work, and a lot of it. Now, sometimes this was real work, right? So that the inmates, or the patients, as they would prefer to have been called, would do things like garden, right? And I'm sure that there was some very real satisfaction in that. Other times, however, it would just be stupid busy work that they'd dump a pile of 6 different kinds of beans on a table and say, sort them. How this did not make people more insane is a loss to me, but nevertheless, that was considered labor, and labor was considered good for you, just period. Okay, so if the project of curative asylums, of curative psychiatry, is to bring people back into some sort of alliance with normal, then the definition of normal is going to matter very much, right? And all new religions, by definition, are going to have to push the boundaries of normal just to make a cultural space for themselves. This little dog is completely upstaging me. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, yes, to make a cultural space for themselves, right? So, you have to differentiate yourself from existing religions in order to justify having a new one. So, all religions at their inception are really going against social norms in whatever degrees they like. And particularly when the majority of believers or a leader of a religion is female, then we start seeing super extra charges of crazy. Now, in the 19th century, there were a number of religions that were sort of generally deemed mad. One of them was being a Shaker, right? So the idea that you could possibly think that the second coming of Jesus was in the form of a woman was so crazy that you were just blanket by some psychiatrists considered mad if you agreed with it. Right? So Shakers were really bizarrely targeted in the psychiatric literature of the 19th century. Spiritualists, of course, are also, kind of looking out there. You've got women claiming all of this authority, and multiple voices speaking through them, and trance states and alternate states of consciousness. And, what you're seeing here is science kind of attempting to hone in on what has traditionally been the purview of religion. Right? What do these things mean? Right? Is that person, a witch? Or is that person crazy? And do we burn her at the stake, or consider her a prophet, or throw her in a madhouse? All right, so particularly in the United States, there was a serious clash between religious novelty and the First Amendment. And they go bump often. So Mormonism was the first American religion to make it all the way to the Supreme Court to determine if it was covered by the First Amendment. And this was vis-a-vis polygamy, and the answer was no, in case you're wondering. But it was by no means the last. And so on not national scales, there were all sorts of skirmishes between religion and the First Amendment. So there were attempts, for example, to declare Shakers civilly dead, so that they, you were physically alive, but you had the status of, a dead person in terms of voting or owning things or anything like that. There were lots of religions and religious movements that were prosecuted on obscenity laws. The Oneida community, people tried this with some frequency. As I always tell my students, if you're going to start your own religion, buy local. So it is literally, their neighbors liked them. They were good neighbors. They employed the locals. They bought from locals. They were, they're quiet. They didn't throw keggers on the weekend. They kind of did, but there was no beer. But anyway, and the town was just like not going for this. And so that kind of, I don't think persecution's really pushing the usage of the term there, is common throughout the 19th century. Now, secondly, just women and asylums. Men have the legal right to throw their wives in a lunatic asylum, and she has no legal recourse at all. This throughout the vast majority of the 19th century. In our reading today, we'll see a little bit of this with Mrs. Packard, Mrs. Elizabeth Packard. This is one of the most crushing stories in American history. But she won, but it was a very hard one. And Mrs. Packard had the audacity at a Bible class to say in front of her husband, who was the preacher, that she didn't think that predestination was necessarily, what God was all about. The next morning, she's in her bathtub, and these burly men come charging in, haul her out of her tub, take her pulse, and determine that she's crazy. And off Mrs. Packard goes. Now, finally, Mrs. Packard not only gets out through the help of her son and, huge letter campaign and stuff like that, but Mrs. Packard also makes a very real difference and becomes the voice of change for the laws about asylums and keeping people against their wills and husbands and wives and things like that in many states. So she becomes this real hero. But she had a terrible time, between here and there. Okay, so today's reading is a little bit on charges of madness in spiritualism. This is Emma Harding Britton. She was born in England, but was one of the greatest spiritualists in America. She lived here, moved here, lived here, married here, but ran back and forth between America and England with great regularity. So Emma has written what remains the single best history of spiritualism. And she uses all of these different sources. So she'll quote whole lines of newspapers and letters and court proceedings. And so it creates this very sort of interesting pastiche of where she's getting her facts. Okay? So Emma takes on spiritualists who are incarcerated for being crazy. And she mentions the dreadful case of Mrs. Packard, so I think that you'll find the reading interesting. And just to, in conclusion, right, we must always keep in mind that whenever there's a phenomenon like women speaking in multiple voices, right, it is the power of the interpreter to decide if that woman is possessed by demons and needs to be exorcised or sent to the Inquisition or burned at the stake, or if that woman has the gift of tongue, right, and has, this aperture onto something supranatural, something, better than this world, and that she should be looked at as, a modern-day prophet, or if that woman is sick, right? Whether that is a pathology, whether she needs to be changed. Now, spiritualists were wildly overly represented in insane asylums in the 19th century, and they took this on. They took this pathologizing, this diagnosis on, right, full front, and did this full court press against this. But there are certain limitations to the laws and, what they could do. So some of these stories are very tragic, some are very brave, but all of them are really about the fight for self-definition. Right? From a spiritualist perspective, this woman is doing priestcraft, right? That she also gets paid for and can travel around and has clients and respect. And so, self-definition and lunacy, which is the opposite of self-definition, are this week's Classlet. All right, thanks very much, folks. Bye.